The heat was already there when Alexandra woke, a dense warmth that pressed against her skin before she opened her eyes. The sheets had twisted sometime in the night, light cotton tangled around her thighs, the other half abandoned. She lay still, listening to the sound of Rome breathing through the open window, a scooter whining somewhere distant, voices rising and dissolving. The soft insistence of life that did not wait for her to decide how she felt about it. She hadn't planned to wake this early. She hadn't planned anything, really. That was the point. But her body seemed to remember where she was before her mind caught up, and that recognition came with a quiet unrest, a sense that something inside her was already slightly off balance. When she finally pushed the sheet aside and sat up, the room held the faint smell of last night's soap and the mineral note of stone warmed by sun. Her phone lay face down on the bedside table. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. For the first time in months, nothing was waiting for her there. Downstairs, the hotel lobby was cool in that deliberate way luxury cultivates, marble floors swallowing footsteps, air conditioned just enough to feel like relief without becoming cold. Alexandra crossed the space slowly, sunglasses in hand, her movements unhurried. No one here knew who she was. No one cared. Thought returned, as it had every morning since she arrived, not as comfort but as a kind of vertigo. Outside, the city hit her all at once. Heat, light, sound. Rome didn't ease you into itself. It opened its arms and expected you to keep up. She took a few steps down the street, then stopped, unsure which direction to take. It didn't matter. That, too, was new. Lost already. The voice came from slightly behind her, amused without being sharp. Alexandra turned. Giulia stood in the narrow shadow cast by a cafe awning, a folded map in one hand, the other wrapped around a small paper cup. Dark hair pulled back loosely, a few strands already escaping. Green eyes that didn't flicker away when they met Alexandra's, didn't scan her clothes for labels or cues. They simply looked, attentive, curious, not lost. Alexandra said automatically. Then after a beat, she corrected herself. Or maybe I am, I'm not sure. Giulia smiled at that, not triumphantly, just as if Alexandra had said something honest without meaning to. That's usually when people need help, she said, stepping closer. Close enough that Alexandra caught the faint bitterness of espresso, something citrus underneath. Soap, maybe. Or skin. They walked together without hurry, Giulia talking, not performing, not reciting facts, but weaving history into the streets as if it belonged there, as if it had always been meant to be told this way. She translated snippets of conversation drifting past them, the cadence of Italian slipping into English and back again with easy grace. Alexandra listened, her attention oddly divided between the words and the way Giulia moved, unself-conscious, grounded, as if the city and her body were in constant agreement. At a corner where the street narrowed, Giulia paused, glancing up at the buildings. "We can cut through here," she said. "It's quieter, less traffic." Alexandra nodded. She followed without thinking. The alley was cool, shaded, the stones underfoot uneven. Their shoulders brushed once when a couple passed them going the other way. It was nothing. An accident of space. And yet Alexandra felt it register somewhere deeper than she expected, a faint spark of awareness that lingered after the moment had passed. They stopped at a small bakery, the kind that looked unchanged for decades. Giulia ordered without looking at the menu. Alexandra watched her mouth shape the words, watched the baker's face soften in response. When Giulia handed her a still warm pastry, their fingers touched briefly. "Careful," Giulia said. "It's hot." Alexandra laughed softly, more at herself than the warning. She took a bite, sugar dusting her lip. Giulia reached out without thinking, brushed it away with her thumb. The gesture was quick, almost careless. And then it wasn't. Giulia's hand hovered, suspended, before she drew it back. "Sorry," she said. Not flustered. Just aware. "It's fine," Alexandra replied. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. They ate standing there, leaning against the cool wall, crumbs falling to the ground. For a few minutes neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it had weight. Alexandra became aware of her breathing, the way the heat seeped back in as soon as they stepped into the sun again. She noticed how Giulia shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a small habit, almost a restlessness. She wondered if Giulia noticed her in the same quiet, unguarded way. This wasn't how things usually unfolded. Alexandra knew that. In her world, encounters were transactional, defined, contained. Even pleasure had structure. Here, there was none. Jaw stretching, unmarked. They walked again, slower now, stopping when something caught Giulia's attention. A doorway, a fragment of mosaic, a story she seemed compelled to share. Alexandra found herself answering questions she hadn't expected to be asked. Not about work. About music she liked but rarely listened to anymore. About mornings she missed. About the feeling of being somewhere unfamiliar and not immediately trying to master it. At a small piazza, they sat on the low edge of a fountain. Water splashed softly behind them. Children ran past, laughing. An older couple argued affectionately in rapid Italian. The world continued, indifferent to the small gravity forming between them. Giulia kicked her sandal off and dipped her foot into the water, sighing. "Too hot," she said, as if that explained everything. Alexandra watched the movement, the curve of ankle, the ripple spreading outward. Thought came uninvited, unsettling in its clarity. I don't want to leave this moment yet. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it wasn't. She leaned back on her hands, feeling the stone warm beneath her palms. Her mind, so practiced at racing ahead, slowed reluctantly, circling the same awareness again and again. The absence of expectation. The relief of not being assessed. The subtle pleasure of being near someone who did not seem to need anything from her. Giulia glanced over, catching her gaze. For a second, neither looked away. There was no challenge in it, no demand. Just recognition. "Do you want to keep walking?" Giulia asked gently. Not pushing. An offer, not an insistence. "Yes," Alexandra said. Too quickly. Then she smiled, softer. "I do." They stood, their movements slightly out of sync, then falling into rhythm again. As they walked, Alexandra noticed herself cataloging the small details without intending to. The way Giulia tucked her hair back when it slipped loose, the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her skin. Or maybe from the city eye. Self. This was dangerous, some part of her whispered. Not because of scandal or consequence, but because of how easy it felt to step out of the armor she wore so well. Because power, she was learning, was not just about control. Sometimes it was about permission. They stopped at another cafe later, sitting close at a small table that forced their knees almost to touch. Giulia translated the menu, then stopped. "Actually," she said, smiling, "let me order. Trust me." Alexandra did. As they waited, the silence returned, thicker now. Alexandra felt it settle in her chest, a low hum of anticipation she didn't try to name. She had the sudden, vivid sense that this precise configuration of heat, stone, breath, proximity, would return to her later, unbidden. That she would replay it, adjusting small details, searching for what it meant. Giulia set the cups down when they arrived, their hands brushing again. This time, neither apologized. Alexandra lifted her cup, the porcelain warm against her fingers. She took a sip, bitter and rich, and let her eyes close for just a second longer than necessary. Somewhere inside her, thought repeated, quiet but insistent, settling into place without resolution. I am not in charge here. The afternoon stayed with Alexandra long after it technically ended. Even when they parted briefly, Giulia promising to meet her later, Alexandra returning to the hotel to shower and change. The feeling did not disperse. It remained like heat trapped in stone, invisible but persistent, radiating upward. Something had begun without ceremony, without permission, and now it existed quietly inside her, unclaimed. She stood under the shower longer than necessary, letting the water run hot, then cooler, then hot again. The rhythm steadied her, or almost did. Her mind returned, uninvited, to the way Giulia's voice had softened when she spoke English, the way her laughter seemed to arrive a half-second before her smile. Alexandra pressed her palms against the tile, eyes closed, breathing through a sensation that felt like anticipation, but refused to name itself as such. Later, dressed in linen that still smelled faintly of the hotel's detergent, she descended the stairs again. The lobby was fuller now, tourists checking maps, a family negotiating directions. Alexandra moved through them as if underwater, aware of being observed only in the most superficial way. She was just another woman on holiday. The thought settled more easily than it had that morning. Giulia was waiting outside, leaning against a column, scrolling through her phone. When she looked up and saw Alexandra, her expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Recognition. Something like relief. "You survived the afternoon," Giulia said lightly. "I did," Alexandra replied. "Barely." They began walking, no destination announced. The city seemed to offer itself willingly now, streets opening into one another, shadows stretching long and thin. Giulia talked less this time. Or maybe Alexandra listened differently. She noticed the pauses between words, the moments where Giulia seemed to choose silence instead. They stopped at a small market near Campo de Fiori. It was crowded but unhurried, people browsing without urgency, fingers brushing fruit, vendors calling out prices with theatrical exasperation. Giulia moved ahead, then glanced back, making sure Alexandra followed. She did. They lingered at one stall, then another. Giulia handed Alexandra a fig, splitting it open with her thumbs. "You have to eat it like this," she said, demonstrating, juice glistening on her fingers. Alexandra watched, then mirrored the movement, the sweetness almost overwhelming. "Messy," Alexandra said, smiling despite herself. Giulia laughed. "That's the point." They washed their hands at a public fountain, the water cool and metallic against their skin. Alexandra became aware of how close they stood, shoulders nearly touching, the shared intimacy of the small practical act. It felt different from anything she could remember, not charged in an obvious way, but thick with awareness. They found a narrow street with a single table set out in front of a wine bar, barely wide enough for 2 chairs. Giulia didn't ask, she simply pulled one out. Alexandra sat. The chairs faced the street, their knees angled toward each other without quite touching. Wine arrived without ceremony. A simple carafe, glasses thin and warm from the air. Giulia poured, her wrist steady. "To nothing in particular," she said. Alexandra lifted her glass. "To that?" They drank. Slowly. The wine was better than expected, deep and earthy. Alexandra felt it settle in her body, not as intoxication but as warmth, loosening something already on the verge of release. Conversation drifted. Not toward confessions, not yet, but toward the small contours of their lives. Giulia spoke about languages, how she loved the moment when someone understood something new because of her. "It's like watching a door open," she said. "Not a big one, just enough to see through." Alexandra nodded, feeling the phrase lodged somewhere inside her. She spoke, carefully, about decision-making, about the weight of being responsible for outcomes that stretched far beyond intention. She did not say CEO. She did not say company. She said, "Sometimes it feels like everything depends on me remembering who I'm supposed to be." Giulia listened without interrupting, chin resting lightly on her hand. When Alexandra finished, she did not offer reassurance. She simply said, "That sounds exhausting." It was. The word echoed, truer than Alexandra had expected. They sat in silence for a while after that. The street filled and emptied again. A couple argued quietly as they passed. Someone dropped a glass somewhere inside the bar. It shattered, laughter following immediately. Life continued, unconcerned. Alexandra felt herself becoming more aware of Giulia's presence, not just physically but temporally. The way time seemed to adjust around her. Slow where it mattered. Unrushed. Alexandra wondered if Giulia always did this to people, or if she was imagining it, projecting something she wanted badly enough to create. They walked again as dusk settled in. The heat softened but did not leave. Street lights flickered on, one by one. Giulia led them toward the river, where the air moved more freely. They leaned against the railing, watching the water catch the last of the light. "I should warn you," Giulia said, almost casually. "I don't really believe in vacation versions of people." Alexandra turned to her. What does that mean? Giulia shrugged. People come here and become lighter, or bolder, or lonelier, sometimes all three. I don't assume it lasts. Alexandra considered this. The thought that Giulia might already be placing boundaries, not walls, but awareness, stirred something complicated in her chest. Relief, perhaps. Or disappointment. I'm not sure what version I am right now, Alexandra admitted. That might be the problem. Giulia looked at her then, really looked. The space between them felt suddenly charged, not with urgency but with gravity. Something had shifted, imperceptibly. Alexandra noticed it not as a moment but as a tilt, a recalibration. They stood there longer than necessary. Alexandra became acutely aware of her own body. The way her breath changed when Giulia shifted closer. The warmth radiating from her arm. She noticed the urge to close the distance, to test the reality of it. She did not move. Later, back near the hotel, they slowed. Neither seemed eager to end the evening, but neither named it. Giulia stopped just short of the entrance, hands tucked into her pockets. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. Not a question. Yes, Alexandra replied. Then, after a pause, I'd like that. Giulia smiled, softer than before. She stepped back, then hesitated. For a moment, it seemed she might say something else. She didn't. She turned and walked away, her figure quickly absorbed by the crowd. Alexandra watched until she disappeared. Only then did she enter the hotel, the cool air washing over her like a reminder. Up in her room she stood at the window again, the city spread out below. She did not reach for her phone. She did not make notes or lists. She replayed the day instead, small moments repeating with subtle variations. The fig, the wine, the way Giulia had said that sounds exhausting, as if she had seen through something Alexandra rarely allowed to be visible. One thought returned, quietly, persistently, settling without resolution. This closeness feels intentional. The evening had already thickened by the time Alexandra met Giulia again, the air holding on to the day's heat as if unwilling to let it go. Rome did that, refused clean transitions. Day bled into night. One blurred into something harder to define. They stood just inside the doorway of the wine bar this time, the room dim, crowded, voices layered over one another in a low, constant murmur. Someone laughed too loudly near the counter. Glasses clinked. The smell of alcohol and warm bodies pressed close. Giulia leaned in slightly so Alexandra could hear her. Too busy? Alexandra shook her head. No, just full. Giulia smiled at that. Not teasing. Understanding. Or maybe she simply let the word be what it was. They found a small table at the back, half hidden behind a column. The light there was softer, shadows stretching unevenly across the wall. Alexandra noticed how Giulia chose the seat across from her, not beside. Space, but not distance. Wine arrived again without ceremony. This time Alexandra reached for the carafe first, then hesitated. A fraction of a second, before pouring. Giulia watched, her gaze steady, curious. You don't have to, Giulia said. Alexandra laughed quietly. I know. Habit. She poured anyway. The gesture grounded her. Or tried to. They talked. Not about plans. Not about tomorrow. About films they half remembered. About cities that felt heavier than they looked. Giulia spoke about Rome in summer, how the heat made everyone more honest, or at least more reckless. Alexandra listened, nodding, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere low in her body. At one point, Giulia reached across the table to move Alexandra's glass slightly, making room for a small dish of olives. Her fingers brushed Alexandra's knuckles. The contact lingered. Too long to be accidental. Alexandra didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She stayed. Still. Letting the moment exist without instruction. Giulia's hand withdrew slowly, almost reluctantly. She didn't apologize this time. Silence folded in around them. Not awkward. Dense. Alexandra became aware of the way her breath had changed. Slower, deeper. She noticed the faint sheen of sweat at Giulia's temple, the way a loose strand of hair clung to her skin. She thought briefly of distance. Of age. Of all the reasons this should remain exactly where it was. No, not exactly. She thought of how rare it was to be here, in this precise configuration of time and place, with nothing demanded of her beyond attention. I should say something, Alexandra said suddenly. Giulia tilted her head. You don't have to. That, somehow, made it harder. Alexandra pressed her thumb against the edge of the table, feeling the worn wood. She searched for the right words, the responsible ones, the clarifying ones, and felt them scatter before she could gather them. I'm not looking for, she began, then stopped. Giulia waited. Patient, thought, not filling the silence. I mean, Alexandra tried again, then exhaled. I'm not sure what I'm looking for. Giulia's smile softened, almost imperceptibly. That's okay, she said. I'm not either. The honesty of it landed gently, without drama. Alexandra felt something loosen in her chest. They ordered food almost as an afterthought. Bread, cheese, something warm and simple. They shared it without comment, tearing pieces, passing plates back and forth. Their hands touched again, and again. Each time, the awareness sharpened, not dulled. At one point, Giulia laughed, a quick, surprised sound, and covered her mouth with her hand. Alexandra watched the movement, the curve of fingers, the way the laughter seemed to escape despite Giulia's attempt to contain it. What? Alexandra asked. Giulia shook her head. Nothing. I forget sometimes how intense this city makes people. Alexandra raised an eyebrow. People like me? Giulia considered her. People like us, right now. The words settled between them. Right now. Not future. Not aftermath. Just this. They left the bar later. The night fully claimed now. The streets were alive, music drifting from somewhere unseen, groups clustered together, movement everywhere. The heat had softened but not disappeared. It clung to their skin, made proximity unavoidable. They walked without speaking for a while. Alexandra felt the urge to reach out, to let her hand brush Giulia's arm, to test the weight of that contact. She didn't. She let the desire remain suspended, a low hum under her skin. They stopped at a corner where the street narrowed again, familiar now. Giulia leaned back against the wall, crossing her arms loosely. Alexandra stood facing her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body. This is usually where I say goodnight, Giulia said. Her voice was steady, curious, open. Alexandra nodded. She should step back. She knew that. She didn't. Giulia, she said. The name felt different this time. Heavier. Or maybe more precise. Giulia looked up at her. The space between them shrank, not because either moved decisively, but because the air itself seemed to draw them closer. Alexandra became acutely aware of everything at once. The sound of her own breath, the faint taste of wine still lingering, the roughness of the stone wall inches from her shoulder. She felt the moment balancing on something fragile. I don't want to misunderstand this, Alexandra said quietly. Giulia didn't smile. She didn't look away. Then don't, she replied. Just stay with what it is. The simplicity of it almost undid her. Alexandra lifted her hand slowly, deliberately, giving Giulia time to step away. She didn't. Alexandra's fingers brushed Giulia's wrist, light, tentative, before sliding upward, resting briefly at her forearm. Giulia inhaled sharply. Not in alarm, in recognition. The kiss, when it came, was unhurried. Not a collision. A meeting. Alexandra leaned in just enough for their mouths to touch, barely at first, testing. Giulia responded immediately, her hand coming to rest at Alexandra's waist, fingers warm through the thin fabric. The world did not stop. Someone passed behind them, laughing. A scooter roared by. But the moment held. Alexandra felt the kiss register in her body before her mind caught up, a spreading warmth, a softening. She pulled back slightly, resting her forehead against Giulia's. This isn't, she began. I know, Giulia said. Her voice was low. Steady. It doesn't have to be anything else. They stood there for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing in sync. Alexandra felt the urge to say more, to define, to protect, to control, and let it fade instead. They parted without drama, without promises. Giulia stepped back first, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Tomorrow?" she asked. Not as a demand. "Yes," Alexandra said, without hesitation. As Alexandra walked back to the hotel alone, the night pressing close around her, she felt the kiss echo, not just on her lips, but somewhere deeper. A quiet, persistent awareness. This had crossed something. Not recklessly. Deliberately. And it wasn't finished. Morning arrived without apology. The light slipped through the curtains in narrow bands, catching on the edge of the bed, the chair, the half-open suitcase Alexandra still hadn't closed. The city sounded different in the early hours. Less performative, more functional. Trucks. Footsteps. Someone arguing softly below the window. Life resuming its shape. Alexandra lay still, eyes open, the echo of the night pressing gently but insistently against her ribs. The kiss had not faded. It had changed temperature. Cooler now. Sharper at the edges. Not regret, not yet, but awareness. Wait. She showered without lingering this time. The water hit her shoulders, ran down her spine, disappeared. She stood there longer than necessary anyway, forehead resting briefly against the tile, as if bracing herself for something she couldn't yet name. When she dressed, she chose clothes that felt more like armor. Crisp. Controlled. The linen from yesterday remained folded on the chair. Untouched. Downstairs, the hotel cafe was quiet, populated mostly by early risers and people pretending not to look at their watches. Alexandra took a seat near the window, ordered coffee she didn't want yet. She held the cup between her palms without drinking, letting the warmth seep in. Her phone vibrated. A message from Giulia. "Are you up?" Alexandra stared at the screen longer than necessary. "Yes," she typed, then deleted it. "Yes, I am." Then paused. Deleted again. "I am." She sent it before she could reconsider. Giulia arrived 20 minutes later, hair still damp, sunglasses pushed up on her head. She looked, Alexandra noticed immediately, more contained. Not distant. Just careful. "Hey," Giulia said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Hey," Alexandra replied. They smiled at the same time. It didn't quite land. Coffee was ordered. Bread arrived. Butter, jam, apple. The mechanics of breakfast unfolded with practiced ease. Hands moved. Cups lifted. Plates shifted. Ordinary. Fragile. Giulia tore a piece of bread, spread jam slowly, deliberately. Alexandra watched the movement, the way Giulia's fingers paused at the edge of the plate, as if aware of being observed. Or maybe aware of something else. "So," Giulia said finally, "how are you?" The question hovered. Simple. Loaded. Alexandra considered the truth, or rather, the many truths, and chose none of them. "Fine," she said. Then, because the word felt insufficient, added, "You?" Giulia nodded. "Same." They ate in silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Not peaceful either. A silence with corners. Alexandra's thoughts fragmented, circling familiar terrain now with new urgency. Control. Consequence. Distance disguised as wisdom. She felt the instinct to pull back assert itself with practiced efficiency. The part of her that knew how to contain moments before they demanded too much. She looked at Giulia and saw not temptation but risk. Not scandal. Something more intimate. The risk of being altered. Giulia finished her coffee, then wrapped her hands around the empty cup, as if grounding herself. "We don't have to pretend last night didn't happen," she said quietly. Alexandra's breath caught, just slightly. "Enough." "I wasn't," she replied, then paused. "Pretending, I mean." Giulia studied her for a moment, eyes searching. "Good." Another silence. Thicker now. They left the cafe together, stepping into the street where the day had fully claimed its rhythm. Vendors setting up. Tourists clustering. Guides lifting flags. Rome resuming its performance. They walked side by side, closer than strangers, farther than before. Alexandra felt the distance acutely, not measured in steps, but in restraint. Every instinct told her to reach out, to re-establish the physical certainty of the night before. She didn't. Giulia noticed. Of course she did. They crossed a small bridge, paused to watch the water move beneath them. Alexandra rested her hands on the railing. Giulia leaned beside her, but not touching. "I should tell you something," Giulia said. Her voice was steady, but there was effort beneath it. Alexandra nodded. "Okay, I'm not fragile," Giulia continued. "I don't need to be protected from moments I choose." The words weren't defensive. They were declarative. Alexandra swallowed. "I didn't think you were." "No," Giulia said gently. "You didn't. But you're thinking about what this costs you. And I'm thinking about what it doesn't." The difference landed hard. Alexandra closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the city was unchanged. The river still moved. People still passed. The world remained unconcerned. "I leave in 2 days," Alexandra said. The words felt heavier, spoken aloud. "I know, and my life," she began, then stopped. "No, not that. My life doesn't have space for—" Giulia didn't interrupt. She waited. "For ambiguity," Alexandra finished. It was the closest she could come to honesty without unraveling. Giulia smiled, small and restrained. "That's the thing," she said. "This isn't ambiguous to me. It's just temporary." "Temporary?" The word struck something sharp. They walked again, the city pressing closer now, crowds thickening. At a crosswalk, Giulia reached out automatically, fingers brushing Alexandra's wrist as the light changed. The contact was brief. Necessary. It lingered anyway. Alexandra felt it like a held breath. They stopped at a bookstore, wandered inside. Dusty air. Shelves stacked too close together. The comfort of quiet. They browsed separately at first, then found themselves standing near the same shelf, reading spines without reading. Alexandra picked up a book, put it back, picked up another. Her focus scattered. Giulia leaned against the shelf, arms crossed loosely. "You're pulling away," she said, not accusing. Observant. Alexandra exhaled. "I'm trying not to hurt you." Giulia's expression softened, but not in relief. In something closer to disappointment. "I didn't ask you to decide that for me." The truth of it settled heavily. They left the store without buying anything. Outside, the heat returned, immediate and insistent. Alexandra felt it differently now, less indulgent, more exposing. She became aware of her body again, not as sensation but as tension. Shoulders tight, jaw set, breath shallow. They stopped near the hotel entrance. The space felt too public, too watched. Or maybe it was just too final. Giulia shifted her weight. A familiar gesture now. She tucked her hair back, then let her hand fall. "I don't need promises," she said. "But I need honesty." Alexandra met her gaze. Held it. Let the impulse to soften the truth pass. "I don't know how to stay in something that doesn't ask for my future," she said quietly. "And I don't know how to leave something that doesn't ask for anything at all." Giulia nodded slowly. "Then don't decide yet." The simplicity of it felt almost cruel. They stood there, the space between them taut. Alexandra felt the urge, sharp, insistent, to pull Giulia close, to reclaim what had already begun to feel like absence. She resisted. The restraint burned. Giulia stepped closer anyway. Not touching. Just near. "I'll be here," she said. "Today. Not tomorrow. Not later. Today." Alexandra watched her turn and walk away, her figure dissolving into the flow of the street. She remained where she was, the hotel doors behind her, the city in front of her, the choice stretching thin and unresolved inside her chest. Not yet. She went inside without looking back. The city did not wait for Alexandra to decide. By the time afternoon began to loosen into evening, Rome had already rearranged itself. shadows shifting, heat settling lower, voices growing more layered. Alexandra spent the hours in between moving without direction. She walked. She sat. She stood at the window and watched people live lives that did not require her input. Giulia's words stayed with her. I'll be here. Today. Not tomorrow. Not a promise. Presence. Alexandra returned to the hotel room and closed the door behind her with deliberate care. She rested her forehead against it for a moment, just a moment, then straightened. The room felt different now. Smaller. As if it had been holding its breath. She changed clothes slowly. Not into armor this time. Into something softer. A dress she'd packed without intention, light fabric that moved when she did. She didn't examine herself in the mirror. She didn't rehearse what she might say. When she left, it was already dusk. Giulia was waiting where she'd said she would be, at the edge of the small piazza near the river, leaning against the low stone wall. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was watching the water, her reflection broken by movement. Alexandra stopped a few steps away. For a long moment, neither spoke. Giulia turned first. Her expression shifted, not into relief, not into triumph, but into something quieter. Recognition. Acceptance. You came, she said. Yes, Alexandra replied. The word felt heavier than it should have. Or maybe lighter. She wasn't sure. They walked without direction, side by side, their pace unspoken but aligned. The space between them remained, not distance, but intention. They passed streets they'd already walked, cafes they'd already visited. Familiarity softened the edges of everything. They stopped at a small grocery store. Giulia went in first, emerging moments later with a paper bag. Bread. Ease. A bottle of wine. Label worn. Unremarkable. My apartment's close, Giulia said. Not an invitation. A fact. Alexandra nodded. Okay. The apartment was small and cool, shutters half closed against the lingering heat. It smelled faintly of citrus cleaner, and something warmer underneath, skin perhaps, or the echo of cooking. Shoes were left by the door without comment. The paper bag placed gently on the counter. They moved around each other with a careful ease, as if learning a shared rhythm. Giulia cut the bread, set the cheese out on a plate. Alexandra opened the wine, the soft pop punctuating the quiet. They ate standing up, leaning against opposite counters, exchanging small observations that did not need to be remembered. The ordinary weight of it all pressed in, not heavy, but real. This was not stolen time. It was given. They moved to the small couch near the window, sitting close enough that their knees touched. Alexandra noticed it immediately. She did not move away. Giulia poured the wine. Their hands brushed. Stayed. The silence stretched, not empty. Expectant. Alexandra felt the clarity forming before the words arrived. A settling. Not certainty, something truer. The recognition that control was no longer the point. That choosing presence did not require ownership. She turned toward Giulia. I'm very good at leaving before things ask too much of me, she said quietly. Giulia listened. Still. Open and eyeing. And I don't want to do that right now. Giulia exhaled, a slow release she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. I'm not asking you to stay longer than you can, she said. Just be here while you are. Alexandra nodded. The decision settled without ceremony. No announcement. No resolution. Just truth aligning with breath. She reached out, slowly, deliberately, and rested her hand at the back of Giulia's neck. Warm. Familiar now. Giulia leaned into the touch without hesitation. The kiss that followed was nothing like the first. It was deeper. Unrushed. Alexandra felt it register not as urgency but as surrender. The letting go of pacing, of outcome. Giulia's hand slid to her waist, then her back, anchoring her there. The world narrowed to breath, to warmth, to the quiet certainty of being met. They moved together without hurry, without instruction. Clothing fell away gradually, without spectacle. Skin met skin, warm, human, real. Alexandra noticed the details she would remember later, The curve of Giulia's shoulder beneath her palm, the faint shiver that passed through her when Alexandra kissed the hollow of her throat, the way her breath stuttered and then steadied. Time loosened its grip. They explored each other not with hunger, but with attention. Touch followed curiosity. Consent was constant, unspoken, but absolute. Alexandra felt herself becoming quieter inside, her thoughts dissolving into sensation, warmth, pressure, the soft rhythm of shared breath. When they came together fully, it was not explosive. It was grounding. Alexandra felt the truth of it settle in her body before her mind attempted to understand it. The unfamiliar relief of not needing to perform, to dominate, to lead. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the narrow bed, sheets twisted, the window open to the night. Rome sounded distant now, softened, almost kind. Giulia traced idle patterns along Alexandra's arm, a repeated gesture that seemed to anchor them both. Neither spoke for a long time. Eventually, Giulia shifted slightly, resting her head against Alexandra's chest. Alexandra felt the weight of it, literal, comforting, and let herself stay with it. Life did not pause. Somewhere outside, someone laughed. Car passed. Time moved forward. Alexandra knew she would leave. She also knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that this did not make the moment smaller. This was not a beginning, not an ending. It was a choice to be present. She closed her eyes, holding the sensation of Giulia's warmth, the sound of her breathing, the city holding them both without judgment. Some moments are not meant to be kept, only lived. What does it cost to choose presence over protection, even when you know you cannot stay? Some stories don't end when the moment fades. They stay with us, asking to be felt. If this story awakens something you recognize, you're welcome to share your truth in the comments. And if this journey stayed with you, consider subscribing to Secret Garden Stories and sharing it with someone who might feel seen. Your support helps this space grow. A world with more love, more honesty, and less silence. Thank you for being here.